Welcome back, everybody, to our epic 50-hour-long online vigil in solidarity with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. My name is Susie Dawson. I'm an activist, journalist, and president of the Internet Party of New Zealand. And I'm very pleased to be joined here by my friend, Diani Burrito. Diani is also a journalist, a researcher, and a whistleblower advocate. She has helped to support some of the most at-risk whistleblowers and journalists in the world, and located primarily in Berlin, Germany. Welcome to the stream, Diani.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for this effort and this for galvanizing this worldwide movement, which is so important. I'm going to call it the network digital army.
Yeah, we like to pair non-violent with the word army because we're not trying to be militaristic, but there's definitely some irony there. And yeah. we're really lucky that so many people have flocked to it and are really building a very strong solidarity network for actions in support of Julian. So I'm very privileged and to be here representing it. But I am just one out of some 2,600 people who put their hands up to be a part of it. So it's pretty amazing, overdue, and in Christine Assange's words, timely enterprise. Yeah. Diani, look, I find you to be actually one of the most fascinating figures that I know because you have you've got such an in-depth knowledge about the history, the journeys of the whistleblowers who are really household names. You have been in Berlin actually, I'll let you tell the story. Tell us about you coming to Berlin and about how you over time got more and more involved in the activism scene, and specifically how you ended up with this very unique area of interest, which is in supporting whistleblowers.
Well, I've been living in Berlin for 30 years now, and I had originally sensed at the age of 18, tender age of 18, that I just didn't think that where the US was going is where I wanted to be and where I wanted to live my life. So I moved to Europe and have been living there ever since. And Berlin in 1989 was a very interesting place, as you could imagine. It was much upheaval. It was the end of the Cold War. It was on pretty much like the Phoenix after that very brutal Cold War. And it was a very amazingly how should I say, open, anarchic, free space where people could build new organizations, institutions. The art community just bloomed. So it was a very interesting place to be. So I felt very privileged to be a part of that. So I'm actually a painter by profession, and I never knew I was going to fall into this line of work. But it became my passion, and it also became my occupation. So essentially it's 2010, and I'm watching the UK Uncut. I'm watching the announcement that we're going to have an Occupy Wall Street, in the US. I was watching with great intent what was happening in Tunisia and in 2011 and in Egypt, and I was very inspired, like a lot of other people. There was a very hopeful time in history. Unfortunately, it was quashed, and the Americans had no intent of allowing any of these Arab countries to achieve some sort of socially equitable, successful revolution, as we've seen in the Americas. So, but we were very hopeful, and I think after advocating for internet access in Cuba, and I was notified by, I think I've told you this before, by the Heritage Foundation that they really liked my work and what could they do to improve my work, I just decided, oh, I must be doing something terribly wrong. So I got very depressed and pretty much dropped out of activism altogether. And I do owe the people of Cuba an apology for having even presumed in my great naivete that would have been a good thing, because essentially they were vying through these groups that wanted internet access for a Cuban Spring, for regime change, and that's nothing I wanted to be a part of. So I quickly retreated and decided that the only cause that I found that was worthy of my time was WikiLeaks, and to defend Chelsea Manning. So it was a very, very small movement in Berlin. An amazing activist by the name Nadine Belkin had started this support group that were 4, maybe 5 very dedicated people in Berlin, and we started organizing rallies and coalescing with politicians and influential people in Berlin to raise awareness of the plight of Chelsea Manning, who'd been getting some very, very, very bad play, a lot of disinformation in the mainstream media, especially the most, distinguished newspapers, including Die Zeit and others, that they were pretty much distorting her public image, what seemed like pretty much at the beckoning of the US government, I wonder, or did these journalists not know any better? So we ended up writing them and translating most of the transcripts, let's say, from the Chelsea Manning trial from the English into German, just to make sure they would understand and correct their reporting on Chelsea Manning. She was projected to have been mentally unstable, a traitor, someone that you just really could not advocate for, basically, human garbage, damaged goods. And so I think that was a very interesting time. I had never had any experience as an activist, and I became the speaker for this Free Chelsea Manning, Free Bradley Manning at the time. And I got over my own personal issues of fear of speaking in public. And I was lucky to run into a very good group of people that became very devoted to support Chelsea Manning, and some were demonstrating every day in front of the British and the American embassies. We organized many rallies together. We happened to have galvanized a cross-section of people from different movements and political convictions, as you're doing now. And so that was interesting. And then, surely enough, it was the summer of Snowden. And at that time, I was already researching quite a bit because I didn't know anything about national security state or the crimes committed by the US government in this regard. And we were ready because we already had all those activists and connections in Berlin. So we organized very, very early on. It was July 3rd, 2013, and we managed to get 10,000 people on the street for Berlin. If you might well know, that is a feat, and major speakers, and we also had other political dissidents also speak. So that was good. We could then get other Americans or to join our cause and raise awareness, to write op-eds and so forth. And at one point, the German government decided to hold an inquiry on the NSA scandal as revealed by Edward Snowden. And I followed that very, very closely. I live tweeted that from German into English. That was quite an educational process. I learned a lot about the legalese and the spycraft of the German intelligence agencies, which were pretty much created by the CIA and backdoored initially, and had secret agreements with the German government for pretty much backdoored everything, and one of the most surveilled countries in Europe, which Edward Snowden also confirmed. So that was very educational. And then, of course, also organizing and trying to raise awareness on the plight of these whistleblowers and how they could not go through the proper channels. And Edward Snowden definitely proved that, and that he was then vindicated later by the ombudsman of the Department of Justice, the Pentagon's ombudsman, that also became a whistleblower and pretty much confirmed that. Each whistleblower had learned from the previous whistleblower. And so it's a very interesting, once you start connecting those dots, these very interesting characters that put everything at risk for the common good, for the public's right to know, that fascinated me. That display of courage was fascinating. And so through all these events in Berlin, I was lucky to help the Courage Foundation to launch their foundation in Berlin, and to work closely with them as a contributor over the years. Sarah Harrison was in Berlin as the acting director, and yeah, it was very rewarding, and I never thought I would ever fall into this line of work, but I'm very glad, very honored to know some of these individuals. So I hope I answered your question.
So as you just said that each whistleblower learned from the last, what I'm also hearing from you is that the activists supporting the whistleblowers learned from the last, because you're talking about how the experience of supporting Chelsea Manning and the networks that you established enabled you to have great agility when it came to needing to support Edward Snowden.
Yes, and then of course, and to establish a public narrative. I mean, Bill Binney and others had been invited to the CCC, which is a very big hacker conference, the Chaos Computer Club Congress, and was it 28C3? Something to that effect. And it was known back then that whistleblowers just didn't translate well into German. And there was actually no proper word for that. In German, that would pretty much be the equivalent of a snitch, which has, of course, very bad connotation, as we know, during the Stasi and the Gestapo. And so a snitch is viewed as a menace to the public good, and someone not to be trusted. So there was a lot of work involved there that had to be done, a lot of footwork, educating journalists, working with journalists, making sure that the reporting was good, becoming a go-to person, working with parliamentarians to try to say, no, what is perceived as an enemy of the state by the US is actually trying to perform a public duty service to Germany, for example, Snowden in this case, and that's how it became relevant to Germany, to try to inform the German populace of this incredible mass surveillance, also willingly conducted by their own domestic and foreign intelligence agencies, which is in complete breach of their pretty amazing constitution. And this had not been known before. So that did change the public perceptions, and suddenly whistleblower became a household name. And of course, sadly though, in spite of all this newfound public awareness on the importance of whistleblowers, Germany still has the worst whistleblower protection laws in Europe, sadly, and has been very, very slow. This Merkel administration and the previous Merkel administration have been very, very slow in implementing those, although it has been signed off by the European Parliament. So again, it's just been galvanizing all these different voices, trying to find out what is effective in activism. I mean, some people are just, you're amazing on a global scale. Activists, we have so much to learn from each other. There wasn't a textbook for this back then. We were all pretty much, new at this. And so I'm humbled and by the experience and the knowledge that I gained and the amazing encounters that I've made over the years with these extraordinary people, whistleblowers, and try to do very interesting events for them in Germany so that people would get to know them. For example, the former Stasi director with Bill Binney together, sitting together as they were Cold War opponents and things like that, sitting down with some of the journalists that had worked on the Snowden documents and so forth, discussing surveillance, just to get a historical perspective, because it is a very big and complex topic, as you well know, because you've been going through the Snowden files and trying to explain this to people. Because if you don't have someone to explain them to you, it's very hard to understand them, especially because there is a special coded language, which we also see in the US with enhanced interrogation and those kinds of very benign sounding terms, but are essentially quite nefarious in nature. So yeah.
When I did the research for Being Julian Assange, one of the things that really fascinated me was the discovery that WikiLeaks had aided in the research into various aspects of pretty major stories related to the Snowden files early on. For example, the Merkel story and others. But they had chosen not to even seek any credit for it. They didn't look for any bylines or anything like that. But I think it is underappreciated how much WikiLeaks has been involved in not just the major WikiLeaks scoops we know about, but some of the other big scoops relating to mass surveillance and related topics.
Indeed. I mean, let me see, about 3 years ago, Reporters Without Borders Germany has actually won a major court case based on a document that was in a WikiLeaks file that had been leaked to WikiLeaks about a database in Germany where journalists legal framework and the Constitution, enshrined in the Constitution. So although there has been some reticence in Germany to acknowledge the value of WikiLeaks as an organization, although, as you know, back then, during the media partnerships, for example, in The Guardian and so forth, they were very willing to have access to that trove, if you will. But now it's deafening the silence how they're also in tow with the U.S. mainstream media, if not demonizing WL and staff and so forth, at this very precarious juncture. Because why? Do they feel threatened with their supremacy over the information of purveyors of information or of news as the typical fourth estate? WikiLeaks has, of course, according to Yochai Benkler, this great Harvard University academic, that had described WikiLeaks as this network's fourth estate. Some would argue the fifth estate, but anyway, I'm just quoting Benkler in the sense that it's so sad to see. It's not so much the fact that this would set a horrible precedent in terms of prosecution or having egregious breaches of law. For example, in Ecuador, extraditing someone to a third country, with perhaps under imminent torture, death, or terrible jail conditions and so forth, and maybe not even a fair trial, to the fact of even prosecuting a publisher or the legal team or the publisher or the staff of WikiLeaks, the journalistic staff, because they're so desperate to hold on to their purview of knowledge. I mean, this is very disturbing. And this also sets off another trend where activists that are not part of the mainstream media are being put unnecessarily at risk by this form of demonization of this network for the state or supporters. So this criminalization of wanting to maintain and preserve and protect a public repository of knowledge, of secret knowledge, which is, I think, Julian Assange's greatest achievement. For me, I think it's equitable to, if you will, the Library of Babylon that had also been burned down. That it was like the most important, impressive library of its time in Syria, Syria, like in Iraq, modern day Iraq, which also inspired Alexander the Great to create his library in Alexandria, which is, of course, debated who burned it down. Was it Julius Caesar, or there's another option there. But he was also, if you will, Julius Caesar was also wanted his history to be told according how he wanted it to be told, and did not want his detractors to write anything negative about him. So it's very interesting now to see this great library wanting to be burnt down by the U.S. government and their willing minions, the empire. This is so important, and I'm sure that this value will be vindicated in generations to come, because we will never have understood the secret machinations of power and how to hold power to account. And as Flick Ruby and many others have said, knowledge is power. And I think that we should have access to this. As Edward Snowden, if we had not known, for example, in Germany, the degree of mass surveillance and what they were actually pretty much forcing their telecom providers to do, we would have been in the dark to this day. And there would have been no corrective instance. Sadly, the Merkel government just pretty much put that one under the table, under the carpet, and they got promoted and they got more money and legalized everything retroactively. We were kind of hoping
this is the theme, and this is
committee moment.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what you're describing, the retroactive legalization.
I just talked too much anyway.
The telcos. This is across the planet. They did it in the UK with data retention law. They did it in Australia with the Aussie IP bill. They did it in New Zealand with the GCSB bill and subsequent bills. Actually, there's about 5 now that have passed through New Zealand in the last 4 years, which have continually enhanced the powers of the spies to continue doing what they're doing and to give them retrospective indemnity or immunity for their past crimes. Everything that I hear you say about Germany and the situation there is exactly how it was for us in New Zealand and exactly how it is in the other countries that form what the NSA calls the global network, their partner agencies. And this legislation, I remember writing in one of my pieces that the US collects countries like baseball cards and that they are legislatively homogenized. And this is what I see is that the country is called Germany or the country is called New Zealand, but they're passing the same laws. They're passing the same laws for the same purposes to commit the same crimes against their domestic populations. And that to me shows how much this is a global agenda that Snowden has blown the whistle on. It's really not just about NSA because they have now 100 partner countries. Netherlands, same thing. We've watched Netherlands agencies going through the same process this year, trying to legalize mass surveillance retrospectively, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
How do we combat it?
First of all, we need to protect
the truth teller.
As John Kiriakou said, the very unique qualities. There's nobody else out there like WikiLeaks, and because of this unique, fearless mission statement, I think we need to protect them because we need to have access and a go-to media platform such as WikiLeaks that feels so strongly about protecting their sources. So that other whistleblowers can come forth because, it seemed like The Intercept, I think Glenn Greenwald is a fearless journalist and I'm very grateful for all the work he has done. But if they cannot protect their sources, then unfortunately I cannot endorse them. And if they keep on and maintain or keep that particular, or those journalists on their staff, in spite of what has happened to Reality Winner, one of our latest political prisoners in the U.S. and most recent whistleblower, if you will, known, I guess, to the Intercept via The Intercept, then we need to protect WikiLeaks and maintain this public repository of knowledge that is mirrored and so forth, so that it just cannot be wiped off and as so many things disappear from the internet, as we well know. That would be one way. Another thing is, as you said, this is such a critical juncture in history, according to my honest opinion, where he who controls the present narrative controls the past, controls the future. And people are forgetting what happened in the past. We see this here in Germany in terms of very few young people really know what happened in the Third Reich, what happened under fascism, what happened during the Holocaust and so forth. We have the far right rearing its ugly head all over Europe now, also ascertaining positions of power. And for example, in Poland, where they're dismissing Supreme Court judges, enacting laws. It's quite frightening what is happening at a very, very fast pace. So great at this point, and that's why I think it's so interesting and dangerous at the same time. If we have this network, the state, which is also the internet, where people like yourself and myself, we don't have to be aligned or be on the New York Times payroll. We can still do valuable service and do reporting, for example, on drone, the drone program, secret drone program, or on torture or on other issues that are crimes of state, basically. So we need to galvanize together and fight against this, if it's still possible, this decay in what is the rule of law. It, as we can see very well in the case of Julian Assange and the team of WL and with WikiLeaks, there's a complete disregard for the rule of law, or they're attempting it, or at least Ecuador, as we see right now, is trying to find some sort of framework where it's possible for him, if you will, but of course he one day he says one thing, one day he says the other, the current president. I don't think he is very trustworthy in that sense. To find a framework that makes it possible for him to deliver Julian Assange, for example, or others, WL potentially, to the US government under maybe, of course, as we know, it's a secret grand jury, paneled grand jury, which would mean what? These are anti-terror laws. These are espionage laws. They could carry, penalty of death. These are very serious charges. For what? For having published secret knowledge, which the New York Times and Washington Post does every day, or quite often. This has not been challenged since the Daniel Ellsberg in the New York Times, and that amazing First Amendment challenge in the Supreme Court for the Pentagon Papers. I wonder if people don't remember that, or they're not willing to, at least in the U.S., to hold that very, very sacred tenet of what we know as U.S. law. So around the world, I think, as you say, there's been very important documents published from around the world, with the Iraq, Afghan war logs, to documents in Australia, to the US, to South America, to Brazil, to Saudi Arabia. This behooves all of us. It's not just, people that are interested in free speech and transparency. This behooves all of us. So I think it's, as what you're doing is a very interesting approach to get all kinds of experts from scholars, activists, journalists that have another insight or view what the value of this endeavor, which we call WikiLeaks, for example.
Yeah, and I'm learning so much myself about the ways in which WikiLeaks has touched on and impacted the lives of people who you'd consider to be unrelated in many ways. Because as you say, they're from all different backgrounds, different areas of expertise, different political interests and affiliations, and yet they all feel so strongly that WikiLeaks must be protected, that Julian Assange must be protected and must be freed. And I think it's remarkable that WikiLeaks speaks to everyone.
And we must counteract, push back against this demonization. I mean, were they not supposed to publish this? The New York Times caved into the U.S. government and didn't publish James Risen's story about, mass surveillance in the U.S. Is that an admirable thing to do for the Fourth Estate? No. And they had, had to wait for George Bush to be reelected to have another 4 years of horror. Is that a good thing to happen? I don't know. I would argue no. So it's very hard to push back in this current McCarthyite Russia hysteria climate, where, as Caitlin Johnson and others, I mean, I don't want to comment on that because I don't know enough about this. I have not been able to look at all this data and about, Lucifer 2.0 and so forth. Unfortunately, I've not been occupied with that. But the fact that they want to prosecute for espionage for a publisher, and why they think they can get away with this and someone else when they publish. It's like we're fighting tooth and nail to protect and preserve the legal safeguards that we have. If we give this one up, we're all screwed, and anyone can be extradited anywhere across the world and can be maybe held, indefinitely and not even enjoy due process. And this is what I think we have to say over and over and over and over again. I think espionage is another thing. I mean, if you ask me, when the German Foreign Intelligence Agency willingly allowed the NSA to hoover all the data of one of the largest internet cross-sections in the world, and to also to spy on their own citizens, as well as conduct industrial espionage, and willingly give it up to the US government for software, for X-Keyscore, for example, that's espionage. Those people should be held to account for treason, not the other way around, just by revealing what the government has done. That is in flagrant breach of their constitution, for example. They unchanged themselves from the constitution.
I completely agree with you, and have made the same point myself about New Zealand's intelligence services, that I believe it is treason for them to supply the private data of their own citizens knowingly to a foreign power and to the intelligence agencies of a foreign power.
Exactly.
However, there's another aspect to it that is frequently overlooked, and that we learned about when Glenn Greenwald came to New Zealand and did the Snowden NZ revelations in 2014. And that's that there's a financial exchange directly involved in all of this. The NSA pays money to the New Zealand intelligence services. The New Zealand intelligence services receive funds in order to supply these services to the foreign power. That is definition of espionage. That's textbook. They're taking the money to give the data of their own citizenry. I don't understand how that could be anything other than mass-scale, state-sanctioned espionage.
So exactly, we have to fight back against that kind of passivity, complacency, shrugging, I can't do anything about it, automation of just keeping people or threatening persons like yourself so that they're silenced and don't raise awareness on these issues. We need to protect those that are in harm's way, speak up for them, help them with their legal defense funds, as, for example, the Courage Foundation does and has very successfully done, for example, in the case of Lori Love, that they fought extradition. That was an amazing campaign done by, a small handful of people that are very, very devoted to make sure that the perception in the public opinion and the court of public opinion is in their favor, so that they can pressure their elected officials to actually sign up and sign a petition to the U.S. government, say, no, we don't want our citizens to be tried or jailed under those inhumane conditions where they probably wouldn't survive it anyway. No country would want to have that, to have such extra legal measures being lodged against their own citizens. I mean, logic, it just defies logic if they wouldn't. So I don't understand this current position of Ecuador right now. What exactly is why are they being taunted this way? Is it IMF money? Is it weapons? It's very unfortunate that this government under Lenin Moreno is trying so hard to defile all of the amazing achievements that have been achieved by the former administration of Correa, that had enacted one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, that was transferring from a fossil fuel economy to a knowledge-based economy with, for example, embracing free, open, libre software, to environmental justice, to inclusion of and protection of indigenous minorities, gender equality. No, we have to reverse all this, and we're going back to like the 70s, like when, the US vassal states in their dirty little backyard, which is South America. I would have thought that South America would have known their lessons and how much was how many people's lives were destroyed in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, and other countries that had experienced that kind of dictatorship. You would think that it's just not that far long ago. It's not 70 years ago, but apparently not. So the tide is changing. And since Vice President Pence went to Ecuador, he's apparently applied a certain amount of pressure on this government, or they have aligned themselves together. And Moreno has pretty much bowed down willingly to alienate Maduro from Venezuela, to align himself with more right-wing organizations and to exit those organizations and treaties that were more left-wing under, let's say, the last 12 years that we had more left-wing governments in South America, and 3, for the extradition of Julian Assange. It's amazing how Correa was so brave, the former president, and pretty much said, all that money that, from those sanctions, save it and educate your own people on human rights. I mean, who's done that in the past? I think the only person who's done that was, Fidel Castro, and lived to tell the tale. So it's very sad to see this very amazing constitution being defiled by this current government and this dissent in lawlessness, basically. And I would hope that the people of Ecuador will show their great displeasure in this and say, no, this is not define us. This is not who we are. This is not who we wanted to be. We wanted to be a light to the world and change and maybe inspire other countries to follow suit.
Diani, you spoke a minute ago about Lauri Love's case, which became, it created a pretty historical precedent, which I see actually other people are already enjoying the benefit of. There was another case last week where the extradition was turned down on the basis of that finding.
The foreign bar, exactly.
Now, I know that Lauri Love became a household name in activism and whistleblower circles because of Julian. Julian actually identified Lauri's case, took Lauri under his wing, and encouraged, arranged for Courage to support Lauri, and which ultimately led to that huge and historic win, obviously with the hard work of the many activists who were involved. And this is something that I think goes under-acknowledged about Julian, is his propensity for helping to save other people who are at risk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that aspect, because one of my arguments that I like to make, which I think is very valid, is that in fighting to save Julian's lives, we do save the lives of countless others who he would help in the future.
Yeah, I mean, Barrett Brown is one of those cases, Lauri Love, of course, Matt DeHart, and other beneficiaries, Chelsea Manning, of course, Edward Snowden, as we know, and has also had contact with other whistleblowers that I know of. We visited Julian, and he's offered his support, moral and otherwise. Yeah, I mean, it's those who are fighting for transparency, free speech, that are putting themselves at risk for the public's right to know. That's something that unifies them, and they, of course, deserve the same sort of support and protection. And personally, it's sad for me to witness some of this, people who just don't or forget that Julian was willing to speak out publicly and offer and provide protection. And for example, as the Courage Foundation was founded at its inception, was after the Snowden event, when they realized, wow, few people have this much experience in terms of banking blockades, or we need to set up an organization, not we, but I mean, an organization needs to be set up for the next Snowden or the next whistleblower who's going to be at risk, in order to offer them veritable protections, because those organizations weren't in place, as John Kiriakou so aptly described that earlier. Where was the ACLU? Where has the ACLU been with the other whistleblowers prior to Snowden? Mum's the word, nothing. So you can't depend on civil liberties, if it's American, obviously, that they're going to rally and take up your case and defend you. So we have Julian Assange to thank for that, and maybe few people know that. And he is now actually, WikiLeaks as such is now also a beneficiary because they have legal defense fund, and they also need and deserve our support and to protect them.
I can't say any better than you just did, and I thank you so much for those words, because that's exactly what we're here for and what we're about. Thank you, Diani, for once again showing your solidarity for Julian and for WikiLeaks, and for for expressing that so eloquently for all of our viewers.
I'm inspired by all the other guests too, by the way. It's not just me. It's just like, okay, no, but
oh, it's absolutely
doing amazing
incredible
work. I'm so in awe of her PhD, and I just imagine what a massive thing, like 10 million documents, and like how do you make sense of all that and try to through an academic PhD show the world how much has, you know, we have WikiLeaks to thank for, you know, in terms of this repository of knowledge. It's really awesome. And so I'm grateful to know all these wonderful people, and yourself included, and I will do everything to raise awareness for this Unity for J movement, and so we can keep and continue to push back. This is not a one-time thing. It's not a short-term thing. This is a long-term thing. Most of these activist cases or whistleblower support things have been over long term, sometimes 10 years, and that takes a lot of stamina and like a marathon runner's type of constitution. So do whatever you can. Everyone can do everything or something. Again, making your elected officials know that this is not acceptable, and petition. I'm keen on petitioning the Queen, the Pope, and anyone else who can offer something in this regard, because it's a very, very critical junction right now, and we're not claiming that the sky is falling unnecessarily. This is a very critical junction, as I mentioned before, where we're unchaining ourselves from the rule of law. And if this test passes, as Scott Ludlam said, if this passes, I can only see a very, very nefarious descent into black secret workings of the state, and yeah, they're going to try everything to allow for this disregard for the rule of law. And I think this is the case. This is the case. So we need to be very, very, very much aware that if we don't speak up and constantly speak up and be relentless in this, they're going to win, and it's going to be a very, very dark future ahead if we lose this one. But anyway, thank you very much for all your efforts, everyone worldwide. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for that warning that I think people really need to take seriously, heed, and listen to for obvious reasons. Okay, thank you so much, Diani.